The morning light cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Vivian's downtown apartment as she stared at the letter on her kitchen counter. The cream-colored envelope bearing the seal of Culpeper County Estate Services. She'd read it 4 times already, each reading no more enlightening than the last. Her great-uncle Thomas had died 2 months ago in a nursing facility in Charlottesville, a man she'd met exactly 3 times in her 34 years. The last time was at her grandmother's funeral in 2008, when he'd worn a gray suit and said almost nothing. Now he'd left her a parcel of land in rural Virginia, and the estate lawyer's letter was asking her to contact their office regarding disposition of inherited real property. The coffee in her mug had gone cold. Vivian set the letter down and picked up her phone, scrolling through the 3 prior emails from the bank. The assessed value was listed as $12,000. $12,000 for land she'd never seen, from a man she'd never known, in a place that barely qualified as a town. She was 2 weeks out of a divorce settlement that had eaten through half her savings. This was not what she needed. The email chain continued below. The bank had already suggested multiple times that she could authorize a sale through their preferred realtor and have funds distributed within 45 days. Easy money, they'd implied. Quick resolution. Get back to your life. Vivian called her sister Rebecca first, the one person she knew would tell her the truth, even if it wasn't what she wanted to hear. Rebecca picked up on the second ring, the sound of her kids arguing in the background, immediately audible. Viv, hey, I can't talk long. Mason just threw orange juice on his sister. What's up? Vivian explained about the land, reading the letter verbatim, listening to Rebecca's response come through a fog of parental chaos. So basically free money from a dead guy you never knew? Sell it, split it with your mom, and move on. You need a vacation, not a real estate project. Rebecca's practicality had always been her strength and her limitation. She saw the world in clean transactions. Sell, split, forget. Vivian asked what Rebecca knew about Uncle Thomas, whether he'd ever mentioned anything unusual or valuable. But Rebecca's response was immediate and dismissive. I don't know. I remember Mom saying he did something secret for the government back in the day, like a defense contractor thing. But he was weird about it. Never talked about work. Anyway, that's like 50 years ago. Sell the land, Viv. Buy yourself something nice. You deserve it. After hanging up, Vivian called her ex-husband Marcus just to see what he'd say. This was a mistake she recognized in real time, but she made it anyway. Marcus answered with his trademark half-laugh, the one that had driven her crazy throughout their marriage. Land in Virginia? What are you going to do with that? You hate the country. You get bugs in the city and call an exterminator. What's the assessed value? When Vivian told him, he laughed harder. 12,000? That's what, 2 months of your old paralegal salary? Sell it. Use it to start fresh. That's actually decent timing, honestly. Vivian hung up on him mid-thought, a small satisfaction in a week of small disappointments. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat at her laptop with a glass of wine, Googling Culpeper County, Virginia, and rural property investment, and finally, just Thomas Graves, Virginia government contractor. The search results were useless. 3 generations of Thomas Graves doing unremarkable things in unremarkable ways. Nothing about her uncle except an obituary from the Culpeper paper, a 3-line mention noting his death at age 86 and his career in Federal Engineering Services. Federal Engineering Services, whatever that meant. By midnight, Vivian had made a decision that surprised her. She would go see the land. Not to sell it immediately, not because she expected anything remarkable, None, but because she'd spent the last year making decisions based on what was practical, what was expected, what would keep her life on its prescribed track. Her marriage had ended because she'd followed the expected script for too long. This piece of inherited earth, worthless as it was, represented something different, an anomaly, a variable she hadn't anticipated. At the very least, she could say she'd stood on it. The following Saturday, Vivian drove south out of the city, watching the urban sprawl gradually give way to strip malls and then to genuine countryside. The GPS took her off the main highway and onto progressively smaller roads, each one more rural than the last. The landscape was beautiful in a way that surprised her. Rolling hills covered in new green, stands of oak and pine, the distant blue ridge of mountains. She'd expected something grimmer, more desolate. Instead, she found herself almost enjoying the drive. The way the traffic noise fell away, the way the air through her open window started to smell like earth and growing things. The property appeared on her GPS as a dot on a secondary road, somewhere between two farm properties. She nearly missed it. The road curved around a thick stand of trees, and suddenly she was looking at a drive barely visible through overgrown brush and weeds. The mailbox at the property line was rusted completely through, the numbers long since peeled off. Vivian pulled carefully through the opening, tires crunching on a gravel drive that descended slightly. What she found was not encouraging. The driveway itself was a confusion of broken asphalt and loose gravel, weeds pushing up through every crack. On to the left was an open field that stretched toward distant tree lines. To the right was a small depression in the landscape, overgrown with briars and volunteer saplings. The entire property seemed to be slowly returning to forest, nature patiently reclaiming what had once been cleared and maintained. She parked and got out of the car, the afternoon sun warm on her shoulders, the silence of rural Virginia pressing around her. She could hear birds, the distant sound of a tractor somewhere beyond the trees. Nothing else. No houses visible, no lights, no signs of human habitation for probably a mile in any direction. Vivian walked the property slowly, trying to understand what she was looking at. The assessed value of $12,000 suddenly made sense. This was a bare lot, with degraded infrastructure, no utilities visible. No structures, no obvious utility or development potential. The driveway curved gently to the right, and she followed it, noting how thick the gravel layer actually was. Underneath, she could feel concrete or asphalt, something solid and substantial. That seemed odd for a simple rural property. The driveway descended as it curved until it was nearly 8 feet below the level of the road. At the lowest point, she spotted something that made her pause. A rusted metal grate, maybe 3 feet square, set flush with what looked like reinforced concrete. It was the kind of grate she'd seen on storm drains, but there was no drainage system here that she could see. No collection basins, no pipes leading anywhere. Just a grate leading down into nothing. She tried to pull it up, but it was seized with rust, locked by decades of weather and oxidation. She photographed it with her phone, still unsure why something about it felt wrong. Felt like a piece of a puzzle she didn't yet understand. By the time she left the property, the sun was beginning its descent, turning the sky gold and then pink. She drove back north slowly, thinking about the grate, about the unusual thickness of the driveway, about the peculiar depression in the landscape that might have been something once, something deliberately buried or hidden. By the time she reached the city limits, she'd made another decision. She was going to call her friend Daniel, the one person she knew who actually understood property and infrastructure. Daniel had been a contractor for the city before pivoting to consulting work. If anyone could tell her whether the Great was significant or just random rural debris, it would be him. Daniel picked up her call on Monday morning, already at a job site, the sound of power tools loud in the background. Vivian could hear his crew shouting something about a foundation inspection. "Danny, I know you're working. Quick question. You remember my great-uncle who died? The one in Virginia? I inherited some land, and I want a second opinion on something." Daniel's response was immediate interest. He was one of the few people in her life who treated her inherited property as potentially significant rather than an inconvenience. "Yeah, of course. I can look at it. Not this weekend, but next weekend I'm free. That's like 90 minutes from here, right? What's the issue?" Vivian described the grate, the unusually thick driveway, the odd depression. She could hear the shift in Daniel's tone immediately. "That's weird. Like, specifically weird for a residential property. That sounds like, I don't even know. Maybe something utility-related? Septic system, old, well. The thickness of the driveway is odd, though. Normal properties don't reinforce driveways like that unless there was heavy vehicle access. What was your uncle's profession again?" "Federal Engineering Services," Vivian said. "Government contractor stuff, I think. That's all I know." There was a long pause. She could hear Daniel talking to someone in the background, then his attention returning to her. "Okay. Yeah, I'll come down next weekend. I want to see this in person. This is bugging me now." The following Saturday, Daniel met her at the property with his truck, his tool belt, and an expression of curiosity that made her feel slightly less crazy for driving 2 hours in the middle of nowhere. Daniel was in his late 30s, the kind of man who'd maintained the same practical competence throughout his life. Someone who understood how things were built and what those building methods implied. He walked the property with Vivian, examining the driveway, the grate, the landscape contours. When he reached the grate, he knelt down and looked at it carefully, running his fingers along the rusted metal. "Okay," he said. "I'm not a government guy, but I know Cold War history because my grandfather built bomb shelters. This is a fallout shelter access point. I'm like 90% sure. The grate design, the concrete beneath it, and the way the driveway's structured. It's all consistent with government civil defense specifications from the 50s and 60s. The words seemed to hang in the Virginia air. Vivian felt something shift in her chest. A recognition that the dead uncle's property had just become something other than an embarrassing inheritance. "You're serious?" she said. Not a question. "Dead serious," Daniel replied. "And if it's what I think it is, this is not a small residential bunker. Look at the extent of the driveway. Look at how deep it descends. This is substantial. Your uncle might have built something pretty significant." Getting the grate open took Daniel nearly an hour. He had to spray it repeatedly with penetrating oil, work it gently with a pry bar, be careful not to break the hinges. Eventually, with a terrible grinding sound, and the grate pivoted upward. Beneath it was a steel hatch, painted government green, with stenciling that read, "USDA Civil Defense Shelter Number 7, Culpeper County Facility, authorized personnel only." The hatch was sealed with a hand wheel, the kind Vivian had seen in old movies about submarines. Daniel looked at Vivian with an expression of pure awe. "Okay," he said slowly. "This is real. This is actually real. Do you want to go in?" The hand wheel turned easier than it should have, Daniel noted, as if it had been periodically maintained despite the exterior rust. As he pulled the hatch open, a smell emerged. Dry, metallic, the scent of sealed spaces and decades of undisturbed air. Beneath the hatch was a ladder leading down into darkness. Daniel retrieved a heavy flashlight from his truck and descended, calling out as he did. "Oh my God. Vivian, you need to see this." The shelter was larger than Vivian expected, larger than it should have been. The beam of Daniel's flashlight cut across a space that had to be at least 30 feet long and 20 feet wide, with a ceiling that stood maybe 8 feet high. The walls were steel-reinforced concrete, painted a pale institutional gray. Along one wall was a series of metal bunks, long since empty. Against another wall were shelving units, many of them still holding sealed containers, their labels barely legible beneath layers of dust. There was a ventilation system visible at the far end, ducting that presumably led to exhaust shafts. Equipment lined the shelves, communication gear that looked military issue, radio receivers and transmitters from decades past, some of it brand new in appearance despite the years, or protected by the sealed environment. "This is insane," Daniel said, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "This is an actual government shelter, like full scale. Someone significant built this. This wasn't some paranoid prepper's backyard bunker. This was official." Vivian stood at the bottom of the ladder, looking around, trying to process the enormity of what they'd found. "My great-uncle built this," she said, understanding it now. "He was a government engineer. He built this for the government. They called it Culpeper County Facility Number 7. He built a fallout shelter in his own property, and the government contracted him to do it." She felt the weight of that knowledge, the unexpected depth and purpose that had been hidden beneath the worthless $12,000 assessment. They explored methodically, carefully, respecting the sealed time capsule that this space represented. The containers held food supplies, freeze-dried packages and military packaging, long expired, but the containers themselves valuable to collectors. There was documentation, actual paper files in sealed plastic binders, maps marked with classified information declassified decades ago, but never recovered or properly archived. There was Cold War-era survival equipment, genuine government issue, the kind that historians and museums sought out. There was a communication suite still powered by a backup generator system, the equipment so specialized it looked like something from a spy film. And at the far end of the shelter, sealed behind a second steel door, was another space. This one was smaller, more private, and unlike the public shelter space, and this one appeared to have been Thomas Graves's personal domain. Inside, they found his documentation of the discovery. On a desk, in a leather portfolio, were detailed handwritten journals, decades of them, documenting his work with the government, the specifications of the shelter, but more importantly, documenting something else entirely: the payments. The government had contracted Thomas Graves not just to engineer and build the shelter, but to accept certain compensation packages outside the normal government contracting system. The journals explained it in careful language. Payments in gold, in vintage government bonds, in assets that could not be easily tracked through normal banking channels. Cold War operational security, deniable assets. Money that could survive economic collapse, that could be transferred without leaving a paper trail. And it was all stored here, in the sealed chamber beneath his property, exactly where he'd left it. Vivian sat on the edge of Thomas Graves's desk, looking at his handwriting, understanding finally why the bank had valued his property at $12,000. They had literally no idea what they were looking at. The search results the following week became somewhat frantic, as Vivian tried to understand her legal position and the actual value of what she'd inherited. She hired an attorney, Patricia Shen, a sharp woman in her 50s who specialized in estate law and who treated Vivian's discovery with the seriousness it deserved. "This is," Patricia said, reading through the documentation, "quite significant. The shelter itself is technically government property, built under contract, constructed to government specifications. However, the personal items, the gold, the bonds, the collections, those are your great-uncle's personal property. The fact that they're stored in the shelter doesn't change that. His will is clear. Everything he owned passes to his nearest heir. You. Vivian asked about taxes, about the legality of possessing the items, about whether she needed to report this discovery to the government. Patricia's response was measured. The gold is legal. It's not stolen. Your great-uncle was paid legally for his services. The bonds are dated, properly documented in his journals. We report the discovered assets. We pay the appropriate taxes, and the remainder is yours. This is going to require careful handling, but it's not illegal. It's unusual, but it's not illegal. Word inevitably got out. Not immediately, but within a few weeks of Vivian bringing in experts and appraisers and historians to examine the shelter and its contents. First came the developer, a man named Richard Kellerman, who showed up at the property with a folder full of comparative market analyses and development proposals. He was dressed in expensive casual clothes and projected the kind of confidence that came from being used to getting what he wanted. "Ms. Graves," he said, standing in the overgrown lot, looking at the sealed hatch with poorly disguised hunger. "I represent Heritage Homes Development. We've heard about your discovery. We're prepared to offer you $2 million for the property. That's well above market value. And it would include our commitment to preserve the shelter as a historical feature, turning it into an educational site and residential community destination." Vivian listened, her paralegal training engaging automatically as she evaluated the terms he was laying out. "You want the land, the shelter, and the contents?" she asked. "The contents stay with me, Mr. Kellerman. The property is not for sale." His expression shifted. "The historical artifacts, you understand, would be much better served in a public museum context. We could arrange for proper curation, secure storage, educational access. Right now, they're sitting in an underground bunker. That's not preservation. That's sequestration." He had a point, but only a partial one. Vivian thanked him and told him she'd consider his offer, knowing already that she wouldn't. Within days, no representative from the National Archives appeared. A woman named Dr. Susan Chen, who arrived with a different kind of proposition. Instead of buying the property, the archives wanted to work with Vivian on documentation and potential donation of the historical materials. "The documents you've discovered," Dr. Chen explained, sitting in Vivian's apartment in the city, spreading photographs of the archived journals and files across the coffee table, "are genuinely significant. This is a first-hand account of Cold War civil defense contracting from someone directly involved. The specifications, the designs, the government interactions. This is exactly the kind of primary source material that shapes historical understanding. If you're willing to donate these materials, with proper tax consideration, the archives would be honored to preserve them and make them available to researchers." The tax benefit, it turned out, was substantial. The historical documents alone could be valued at nearly $400,000, creating a significant charitable deduction that would offset the taxes on the discovered gold and assets. Vivian found herself increasingly drawn to this option. The idea that her great-uncle's work, his careful documentation, could become part of the historical record rather than disappearing into a private collection or developer's real estate portfolio. Then came her cousin Jonathan, appearing at her apartment unannounced, a distant relative she'd never properly met, claiming that the inheritance had been improperly divided and that he deserved a share of the discovered assets. Jonathan was approximately her age. He is dressed in clothes that suggested he was perpetually underfunded. And he brought with him documents claiming that an older will existed in which Thomas Graves had left a portion of his estate to Jonathan's father, Thomas Graves's younger brother. "My father passed before your great-uncle," Jonathan explained. "But according to the intestacy laws at that time, his share should have passed to me. You inherited everything, but I'm entitled to a portion. That's just fairness." Patricia Shen handled Jonathan with a kind of legal precision that Vivian found quietly satisfying. The older will was located and examined. It was indeed real, and it did indeed reference Jonathan's father receiving a portion of the estate. But it had been superseded by a newer will, dated 15 years prior, in which Thomas Graves explicitly wrote out of the will any remaining family members aside from Vivian. The language was not kind. In his final will, Thomas Graves had been explicit. Jonathan's family had not maintained contact with him in decades, had made no effort to know him, and deserved nothing. "The will is valid," Patricia told Jonathan, with neither sympathy nor hostility. "And it's ironclad. You have no legal claim." Jonathan left angry, but he left. The real pressure came from a combination of directions. The developer kept increasing his offer. $3 million, then $4 million. A documentary production company wanted to film the discovery and subsequent restoration of the site. A podcasting network wanted to do a serial deep dive into the shelter's history. And a university wanted to include the shelter in a Cold War history curriculum. And underneath all of it was the simple fact that Vivian's life, as she'd known it, had fundamentally changed. She was not a woman who'd inherited $12,000 from a dead relative. She was a woman who'd inherited $3 million in gold and government assets, a genuine Cold War artifact. A piece of American history that scholars and developers and media companies were suddenly desperate to access or exploit or document. She quit her job in the city. It was the first thing she did after Patricia completed the legal work and confirmed the value of the discovery. Vivian sat down in her office one morning and sent an email to her firm's managing partner, citing family matters and personal circumstances requiring her relocation. They offered her more money. She declined. She was tired of the script that had been written for her life. She was tired of doing things the expected way. By early summer, she'd relocated to Virginia. She'd purchased a modest home on 40 acres adjacent to the shelter property, hired contractors to carefully restore the bunker, and begun the process of working with the National Archives on the donation and curation of Thomas Graves's historical materials. The shelter itself was transformed into something between a museum and a historical monument. The public access areas were opened for educational tours twice monthly, hosted by local historians and graduate students from the University of Virginia. The personal effects of Thomas Graves, his clothing, his books, his personal correspondence, were boxed and archived according to preservation standards. The gold and bonds were stored in a secure vault, generating income that funded the ongoing maintenance and interpretation of the site. The documentary crew filmed for 3 weeks, capturing the restoration process, the expert interviews, the careful unpacking of decades of secrets. The podcast became popular enough to be picked up by a major network. The university included Thomas Graves's shelter in their Cold War curriculum. And Vivian herself, formerly a paralegal in a dying marriage, became the keeper of her great-uncle's legacy. The woman who'd inherited worthless land and discovered that worthless land could become something remarkable if you were willing to look beneath the surface and if you were willing to ask questions instead of accepting easy answers. By autumn, the shelter was welcoming its first official groups of visitors. Historians, students, Cold War enthusiasts. and simply curious people driving up rural Virginia roads to see the place where American history had been carefully preserved in steel and concrete and gold. Vivian walked visitors through the facility, explaining Thomas Graves's work, describing the mindset of Cold War engineers tasked with planning for apocalypse, showing the remarkable preservation of the shelter's contents. She found she had a gift for it, for translating the technical into the comprehensible, for making people understand why what they were seeing mattered. At night, she sat on the porch of her new home, looking out at the Virginia hills, and thought about her ex-husband, not laughing when she'd mentioned the worthless land. She thought about her sister's certainty that the only rational response was to sell. She thought about the bank's assessment of $12,000, a number that had literally no connection to reality. She thought about how many times in life you were told that something was worthless, that something didn't matter, that the expected response was to accept the assessment and move on. What if you didn't? What if instead you asked questions? What if you drove out to look at the meaningless land yourself? If you found the rusted grate? If you called your friend Daniel? If you said no to the developer's offers? If you chose connection over transaction? The shelter became something more than a museum. It became, in Vivian's understanding, a monument to the decision to look deeper, to trust your instincts over the consensus opinion, to believe that value could exist in unexpected places. By the time the winter came, the shelter had been visited by more than 500 people. The university was developing an entire class around the shelter and its history. The National Archives exhibition, featuring Thomas Graves's journals, had become one of their most visited online collections. And Vivian had established a foundation dedicated to documenting and preserving Cold War civil defense infrastructure. The bunkers and shelters and emergency systems that had shaped American thinking about survival and security for an entire generation. She'd also, somewhat unexpectedly, begun a relationship with Daniel, who'd gradually become the property manager and restoration supervisor for the site. And they'd bonded over the complexity of the work, over the careful handling of historical artifacts, over the shared belief that the shelter meant something, that the effort to preserve it mattered. One afternoon in late October, Vivian was standing at the entrance to the shelter, where the steel hatch had been cleaned and preserved as a display piece, when a woman approached her. The woman was in her 70s, wearing a cardigan and carrying a notebook. She introduced herself as Margaret Dobbs, Thomas Graves's former neighbor from the 1960s, when the shelter was being built. "I recognized the name in the news," Margaret said, "when they talked about the discovery. I knew your great-uncle, you know. Everyone around here knew something was being built, something unusual. The government trucks, the concrete being poured. But Thomas never said anything about it. He was a private man." Vivian invited Margaret inside, gave her the full tour, answered her questions about the construction, about Thomas's work. At the end, Margaret said something that stayed with Vivian. "He was building for the future," Margaret said, looking at the preserved shelter. "Even though he never talked about it, even though he kept it secret, he was thinking about what would last, what would matter 50 years later. I think he'd be happy to know his work is being honored now." After Margaret left, Vivian stood alone in the shelter, in the space her great-uncle had engineered and built, had maintained, had filled with his careful documentation and his collected assets. She understood, finally, what the worthless land had actually been. It had been a gift, but not the kind she'd initially recognized. The gift wasn't the money, though that was significant. The gift was the permission to trust her own judgment, to reject the easy answer, to believe that something overlooked and dismissed could actually contain remarkable value. The bank had said the land was worthless. The bank had been wrong. The bank didn't understand that value exists in many forms, that some things are only valuable if you're willing to invest time and attention in discovering what they actually are. Vivian had inherited property that everyone said didn't matter. She discovered that it mattered profoundly, not because the gold was worth millions, though it was, but because the shelter represented something larger, a connection to history, a testament to her great-uncle's integrity and foresight, a piece of the past that deserved to be preserved and honored and shared. By December, with the shelter fully operational and the visitor programs established, Vivian made one final decision about the property. She was offered a position by the University of Virginia to establish and direct a new Cold War Studies Center based at the shelter, combining it with archival work, educational programming, and ongoing research. She accepted. The worthless land had become the centerpiece of her new life, the foundation of work that mattered to her in ways she hadn't anticipated when she'd first read that cream-colored letter from the estate attorney. She thought often of the moment when she'd stood in Daniel's truck, staring at the photograph of the rusted grate, and feeling the small spark of curiosity that had made her decide to drive south and look at the land herself. That single decision, to see it with her own eyes, to ask questions, to dig deeper, had changed everything. It had ended one chapter of her life, the one written in expected patterns and practiced certainties, and opened another one entirely, one based on discovery and trust in her own judgment. The quiet land in Virginia, which the bank had assessed at $12,000 and dismissed as worthless, had turned out to contain not just gold and government bonds and historical artifacts, but the possibility of an entirely different future. One that she'd never have found if she'd simply accepted what everyone else had told her about what the property meant. As it turned out, the most valuable things were sometimes the ones hiding just beneath the surface, waiting for someone willing to stop and look, to ask the hard questions, to believe that worth could exist in unexpected places. The quiet claim on that piece of Virginia earth had become Vivian's claim on a new life, a legacy, and a purpose that extended far beyond what any appraisal could capture. The Quiet Claim channel is dedicated to telling these stories. The stories of people who inherit, acquire, or discover properties that the world has written off as worthless, only to find that value, history, and meaning were waiting beneath the surface all along. Some discoveries are made because someone decided to dig deeper, because they trusted their instincts, because they asked one more question. Thank you for watching. Unsubscribe to The Quiet Claim to discover more stories like Vivian's, more forgotten properties that contain hidden history, more proof that the things the world dismisses are sometimes exactly where we should be looking. Vivian's arrival. The journey to the property. Vivian left the city on a Friday morning in early October. The GPS coordinates entered into her phone like coordinates to a grave she'd never known existed. The highway south was congested for the first hour, traffic thinning as she moved beyond the suburbs into the exurban fringe, where the land began to roll and breathe. She crossed the Rappahannock River around mid-morning, watching the water catch the sunlight, remembering that Rebecca had texted her something about not wasting time on a worthless lot. But Vivian had stopped listening to her sister's certainties a long time ago. The turnoff came at a small town called Culpeper, a place that time seemed to have both preserved and abandoned simultaneously. The downtown had the architecture of a thriving regional center from 100 years ago. Brick buildings, wide streets, the bones of commerce and activity. But the storefronts were mostly empty now, or occupied by thrift stores and tax preparation services. A single traffic light controlled the main intersection. Vivian pulled into a gas station on the edge of town to ask for directions, knowing, even as she did, that GPS could find coordinates, but couldn't necessarily explain what those coordinates meant to people who actually lived in the place. The attendant was a woman in her 60s, thin and weathered, wearing a faded polo shirt with an embroidered logo from some hardware store chain that no longer existed. Vivian asked about the property by address, reading it off her phone, watching the woman's reaction shift from bored to curious. "That's old Carver's place," the attendant said immediately. "Out on Gorman Road, about 8 miles east. Nothing out that way anymore. Used to be farms, but most people sold off, moved to town, or moved away entirely. Carver's been gone for years. Place has been sitting empty." Vivian asked if the woman knew anything about it, the property, its history, what it had been used for. The attendant shook her head. "Just knew it was Carver's place. He was private, kept to himself. Government work, I think, something like that. People don't really go out that way anymore." The roads out to the property became progressively smaller and more rural as Vivian drove, the main highway giving way to state routes, then to county roads, then to roads that barely qualified as maintained. The landscape was beautiful in ways that surprised her. Rolling hills covered in autumn oak and pine, farmland being converted back to forest, the kind of land that had seen intensive human use and was now gradually being released back to itself. The winding roads meant her GPS arrival estimate kept pushing back. What should have been a 40-minute drive from the gas station stretched to 50 minutes as the roads curved and intersected, and sometimes seemed to be leading in the opposite direction from where she intended to go. The trees pressed close to the pavement. She passed abandoned farm equipment, a collapsed barn with vines growing through its wooden framework, a mailbox so rusted it had nearly fused with its post. The afternoon had shifted from bright to that softer autumn light, where the sun hangs low and makes everything look slightly golden and slightly melancholy. The property entrance appeared almost without warning. The GPS showed her arrival at the coordinates, but the coordinates corresponded to a barely visible break in the tree line and a mailbox that was more rust than metal, its numbers long since fallen off or oxidized beyond recognition. Vivian turned carefully into the drive, her car's suspension protesting the first few feet of broken asphalt and loose gravel. She could feel the driveway beginning to descend almost immediately, spiraling down in a gentle curve that seemed far too deliberate for a simple rural residential property. The vegetation on either side was dense and tangled. Briars, saplings, the kind of growth that had taken advantage of neglect to reclaim what had been cleared. Halfway down the drive, Vivian could no longer see the road behind her. The landscape had folded up around her, creating a sense of descending into a contained space, a pocket of the world that had been deliberately isolated from sight. She parked in a small clearing where the drive leveled out. Though calling it a clearing was generous, it was more that the dense brush gave way to slightly less dense brush, and that was where she left her car. The moment she stepped out, the quality of the air changed. The silence was substantial, not the kind of silence that only existed far from human occupation. She could hear birds, but they sounded distant, as if even the birds knew to maintain some distance from this place. The temperature was cooler here, shaded as it was by the forest, and there was the smell of earth and decay, of organic matter in the process of returning to soil. Vivian walked the perimeter of what she could see, trying to understand the layout of the property. The driveway itself was strange once she examined it closely. Its surface was cracked and broken, showing decades of weather damage. But underneath the surface, she could feel solid pavement, something much more substantial than a simple residential driveway would require. The thickness of it was unusual. When a section of the asphalt had broken away, revealing the substrate, she could see layers of concrete, gravel, and what looked like reinforced materials. This was the kind of driveway that had been built to support heavy vehicles, not passenger cars. To the left of where she'd parked was a depression in the landscape, a kind of sunken area that was heavily overgrown with briars and small trees. The depression was probably 15 feet across and maybe 3 feet lower than the surrounding grade. And it formed a rough rectangular shape that suggested it had once been deliberately excavated. Vivian tried to navigate into the depression, but the briars were too dense, too aggressive. Whatever had been there was completely reclaimed by vegetation. To the right of the parking area, the landscape opened into what had once been a cleared field. It stretched away toward distant tree lines. The grass, now tall and unmowed, filled with wildflowers and the kind of plants that volunteered in undisturbed ground. Probably 50 yards from the driveway, she could see the faint remains of what might have once been a small building, a foundation now barely visible beneath accumulated soil and plant growth. She photographed everything with her phone, her paralegal instincts engaging. Document everything, gather visual evidence, build a record of what exists. The light was beginning to shift toward evening, the sun moving lower, the shadows lengthening. She had maybe 90 minutes before it would be too dark to safely drive the rural roads back to her hotel in Culpeper. She sat on the hood of her car and called her sister Rebecca, knowing what the response would be, but needing to hear it anyway. Later, Rebecca picked up with the same background chaos of her life. Kids arguing, a dog barking, someone asking about dinner. "Viv, you there?" "I'm at the property," Vivian said. "In Virginia. I drove down this morning." Rebecca's response was immediate and predictable. "Okay, so what? It's land. There's probably some development possibility or something. Call a realtor and list it. 3 months from now, you'll have money in your account, and you can forget about this dead relative who left you dirt." Vivian asked Rebecca if she remembered anything else about their Uncle Thomas, anything about his work or his life. Rebecca sighed the sigh of someone who'd already had this conversation and didn't want to have it again. Mom said something once about him building things for the government? Like military stuff or civil defense something? It was a long time ago, Viv. He was weird about it. Didn't talk about what he did. Honestly, he seemed kind of paranoid if you want to know the truth. But that was like 30 years ago. Whatever it was, it's over. Sell the land and move on. After Rebecca hung up, Vivian sat looking at the overgrown property, at the strange depression in the landscape, at the unusually substantial driveway, at the way the entire lot seemed designed to be hidden from sight. She thought about her Uncle Thomas, a man she'd met 3 times in her life. A man who'd worked for the government, a man who'd been private and protective of his work. She thought about the assessment of $12,000, a number that now seemed actively wrong, in some way she couldn't quite articulate. As the light faded, she headed back toward town, driving slowly on the winding roads, passing through the small towns that had been old when she was born, and would be old long after she was gone. The next morning, she called Daniel from her hotel room in Culpeper, catching him at his office. She explained about the property, about the unusual driveway thickness, about the depression in the landscape. Daniel's response was immediate interest, his contractor's mind engaging with the problem. "That doesn't sound normal," he said. "Not for a residential property. Driveway that thick, that deliberately engineered, that suggests commercial access or specific requirements. You said your uncle did government work?" "Some kind of civil defense contractor," Vivian said. "That's all I know." Daniel was quiet for a moment, and she could almost hear him thinking. I want to see this," he said finally. "Not this weekend, I'm booked, but next weekend. That's what, 90 minutes from here? Let me clear my schedule." Expanded shelter discovery. The following Saturday, Daniel arrived at 10 in the morning with his truck his tool belt, and a forensic curiosity that made Vivian feel less crazy for driving 2 hours to stare at an overgrown lot. He was a tall man with the kind of practical competence that came from decades of understanding how things were physically constructed. He'd been a city contractor before pivoting to consulting, and he retained the direct way of assessing spaces that came from years of looking at buildings and understanding what their structural systems implied about their purpose and use. They walked the property together, so when Vivian pointed out the things that had been nagging at her: the unusual thickness of the driveway, the engineered feel of the landscape, the suspicious depression that suggested something had once existed and then been deliberately obscured. Daniel knelt at several points along the driveway, running his hands over the broken asphalt, exposing the substrate beneath. The expression on his face shifted as he examined what he was looking at, moving from curiosity to something that looked like recognition. "My grandfather built bomb shelters," Daniel said, standing up and looking at her. Back in the 50s and 60s, civil defense was a big thing. People were legitimately terrified of nuclear war. The government had programs, contractors who specialized in shelter construction. This driveway, the thickness, the composition, and the way it's engineered, this is consistent with specifications for fallout shelter access roads. It's designed to support heavy equipment and to handle the structural load of what's underneath. They found the grate during their examination of the lowest point of the driveway. It was a steel grate, maybe 3 feet square, set flush with reinforced concrete. The kind of grate she'd seen on storm drains in the city, but absolutely out of place on a residential property in rural Virginia. Daniel examined it carefully, running his fingers along the rusted edges, tracing the design of the bars. "This is it," he said with certainty. "This is a fallout shelter access point. I'm 95% sure. The grate design, the way the concrete is poured around it, the overall structure, it's all consistent with civil defense specifications from the era. Your uncle didn't just do government work, Vivian. He built a shelter. For the government, probably for his own property." Getting the grate open took nearly 2 hours. Daniel had to spray it repeatedly with penetrating oil, working it gently with a pry bar, being careful not to damage the hinges. The rust had seized the metal completely, decades of weather exposure welding the moving parts together. Eventually, with a terrible grinding sound that echoed across the quiet property, the grate finally pivoted upward. Beneath the grate was a steel hatch, painted in government green, with stenciling that read in faded letters: USDA Civil Defense Shelter Number. On 7. Culpeper County Facility. Authorized personnel only. Daniel and Vivian looked at the hatch in silence for a long moment. "Well," Daniel said finally, "this is real. This is actually real. Do you want to go down?" The handwheel of the hatch was corroded, but surprisingly functional, as if it had been periodically maintained despite the rust. Daniel turned it carefully, listening to the mechanism engage, and pulled the hatch open. A smell emerged immediately. Dry, metallic, the scent of sealed spaces and decades of absolutely undisturbed air. Beneath the hatch was a ladder leading down into absolute darkness. Daniel retrieved his heavy flashlight from the truck, the kind that contractors used for inspecting dark spaces, and descended slowly, calling out as he did. "Oh my God, Vivian. You need to see this." The shelter was far larger than it should have been. The beam of Daniel's flashlight cut across a space that had to be at least 30 feet long and 20 feet wide, with a ceiling approximately 8 feet high. The walls were reinforced concrete, painted institutional gray, covered with a thin layer of dust that had accumulated over decades. Along the far wall was a series of metal bunks, clearly designed to accommodate multiple residents for extended periods. Along the adjacent wall were shelving units, many of them still holding sealed containers, packages in what appeared to be military marking. The labels were faded but readable enough to make out. Freeze-dried rations, potassium iodide tablets, water purification, survival supplies. The temperature in the shelter was noticeably cooler than outside, and the air had the quality of a sealed time capsule, untouched for decades. Along the far end of the main chamber, Vivian could see what appeared to be a sophisticated ventilation system, large diameter ducting that must have led to exhaust shafts somewhere on the property. Against one wall was a bank of equipment that looked military issue. Radio receivers and transmitters, communication gear that looked like it had been manufactured sometime in the 1960s and then left in perfect preservation. Some of it looked brand new, the steel still shiny, the equipment still clearly functional despite the years. "This is insane," Daniel said, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "This is an actual, full-scale government fallout shelter. This isn't some paranoid prepper's backyard bunker built by an amateur. This is official. This is significant. Look at the engineering. Look at the quality of construction. Someone very competent built this, and they built it with government specifications and approval." Vivian stood at the bottom of the ladder, trying to process the enormity of what they were looking at. Her great-uncle Thomas had built this for the government as a contractor. He'd engineered and constructed a fallout shelter that was still sitting here, still preserved, still functional in many ways, decades after the Cold War had theoretically ended. She understood now why the bank's assessment had been $12,000. The assessment was based on the visible property, the land, the overgrown fields, the degraded driveway. The assessment made no allowance for a government fallout shelter because the assessment process had no way of knowing the shelter existed. The system had completely missed what was underneath. They explored methodically and carefully, moving through the space, respecting the sealed time capsule that this underground facility represented. The main chamber was divided into sections: a living area with the bunks, a supply storage area with the food and medical provisions, and what appeared to be a utility space at one end with tanks and pipes and mechanical systems that had been engineered to support extended habitation. The containers held food supplies, genuine government military rations, packages marked with decade-old dates but sealed well enough that they were probably still intact and edible. When there was documentation, actual paper files in sealed plastic binders, maps marked with what appeared to be classified information, though that information had almost certainly been declassified decades ago, but never recovered from this underground storage. There was a communication suite that looked like something from a spy film. Genuine government equipment, radio transmitters and receivers, with frequencies and capabilities that seemed designed for something more sophisticated than simple civil defense communication. And at the far end of the shelter, separated from the main space by a sealed steel door, was another chamber. This one was smaller, perhaps 10 by 15 feet, and unlike the public shelter space, this one clearly bore the marks of personal occupation. There was a desk, a chair, filing cabinets, for shelves holding books and personal papers. It looked like a private office that Thomas Graves had maintained within the shelter. Daniel whistled low. "This is something else," he said. "This is not a public bunker. This is someone's personal project. Your uncle didn't just build this for the government. He kept something here. Personal things." Inside the sealed chamber, they found Thomas Graves's documentation. On the desk, in a leather portfolio, were handwritten journals, dozens of them, dating back to the 1960s and continuing through recent years. The handwriting was precise and methodical, the entries dated and organized. The early journals documented Thomas's work as a government contractor, specifications, building requirements, engineering specifications, government contracts. But as the journals continued, the content shifted. They became documentation of payments. The government had contracted Thomas Graves not just to engineer and build the shelter, but to accept certain compensation packages outside the normal government contracting system. The journals explained it in careful language. Years of meticulous record-keeping, payments in gold, vintage government bonds, precious metals, assets that could not be easily tracked through normal banking channels. Cold War operational security, Thomas had written, deniable assets. Money that could survive economic collapse, that could be transferred without legal documentation, that could exist independent of the banking system. And it was all stored here, he documented, carefully cataloged and preserved exactly where he'd left it. Waiting. Expanded complications. Richard Kellerman appeared at the property exactly 9 days after Vivian's discovery became public knowledge. He arrived in an expensive car, dressed in the kind of casual clothes that required significant income to purchase, projecting the confidence of someone who'd spent decades getting what he wanted through the application of money and persistence. He had a folder full of documents, comparative market analyses, development proposals, environmental assessments. He'd clearly done research. He knew about the shelter. "Miss Graves," he said, standing on the overgrown lot where the hatch had been cleaned and preserved as a display piece. "I represent Heritage Homes Development. We've become aware of your remarkable discovery. We're prepared to make you a substantial offer for the property. $2 million. That's a significant sum. I think you'll agree. And it would include our firm's commitment to preserve the shelter as a historical feature, turning it into an educational center and residential community destination." Vivian listened to his proposal, her paralegal training engaging automatically to evaluate the terms, the language, the implications. Kellerman was smooth, professional, clearly experienced at this kind of negotiation. He'd clearly thought through the appeal, history preservation, education, community benefit, all while developing the property into something profitable. "The property is not for sale, Mr. Kellerman," Vivian said. "The contents are definitely not for sale." He smiled, the smile of someone who'd heard no before, and knew that it sometimes meant not yet. The historical artifacts, you understand, Osh would be much better served in a public museum context. We could arrange for proper curation, secure storage, educational access at a scale that a private individual couldn't possibly manage. Right now, those materials are sitting underground. That's not preservation. That's sequestration. He had a point, only a partial one, and Vivian thanked him and told him she'd consider his offer, while knowing already that she wouldn't. Kellerman left a folder with his contact information, his business card, his preliminary assessment. "Think about it," he said. "This property is significant. It shouldn't be wasted on private ownership. It should benefit the broader public. I can make that happen." Within days, the pressure began from multiple directions. Dr. Susan Chen from the National Archives appeared with a different kind of proposition, bringing with her detailed photographs of Thomas Graves's journals and a comprehensive list of reasons why the documents belonged in a public institution. "These materials," Dr. Chen explained, sitting in Vivian's hotel room in Culpeper, spreading documents across the table, "are genuinely significant. This is a first-hand account of Cold War civil defense, contracting from someone directly involved in implementation. The specifications, the engineering details, the documentation of government procedures. This is exactly the kind of primary source material that shapes historical understanding. if you're willing to donate these materials. The archives would be honored to preserve them and make them available to researchers. Then came her cousin Jonathan, arriving unannounced at Vivian's apartment in the city, a distant relative she'd never properly known, claiming that the inheritance had been improperly distributed and that he deserved a share of what Vivian had discovered. Jonathan was approximately her age, dressed in clothes that suggested perpetual underfunding, and he carried with him documents claiming the existence of an older will in which Thomas Graves had designated Jonathan's father to receive a portion of the estate. "My father passed before your great-uncle," Jonathan explained, his voice taking on the desperate tone of someone trying to justify claims that felt thin even to himself. "But according to intestacy law at that time, his portion should have transferred to me. You inherited everything, but I'm entitled to something. That's just fairness." Jonathan's argument was technically coherent, but practically weak. Patricia Shen and the attorney Vivian had hired handled it with the kind of legal precision that Vivian found quietly satisfying. The older will you're referencing did exist, Patricia confirmed to Jonathan, reading from the file she'd obtained. "And it did indeed designate your father to receive a portion of the estate. However, that will was superseded by a newer document dated 15 years prior, in which Thomas Graves explicitly and deliberately wrote out of his will any remaining family members, with the exception of Vivian Gates. The language was clear and deliberate. I quote, "My nephew Jonathan and his family have made no effort to maintain contact, have not known me as a person, and deserve nothing." Jonathan left Vivian's office angry, but he left, and his claim evaporated. The real pressure came from the developer, who kept increasing his offers. 3 million, then 4 million, then 5. Kellerman became increasingly transparent about his interest, eventually revealing that the property itself was valuable not for its land or its shelter, but for what the shelter represented in terms of tourist attraction and development anchor. "Think bigger," Kellerman said when he reappeared 2 weeks later. "Don't think of this as a property. Think of this as the centerpiece of a Cold War historical park, a residential community built around that centerpiece, educational facilities, a museum. I'm talking about creating something significant here. Something that would employ people, bring money to this area, generate real economic benefit. And you'd be wealthy beyond what you can imagine." Vivian said no, not to the money, though the money was certainly a factor, but to the idea that the shelter and the property belonged in the hands of a developer who saw it primarily as a profit center. Then came the pressure from another direction. The county building inspector appeared, a man named Henry Parsons, with a different kind of claim. He arrived with a clipboard and an expression that suggested he'd been sent to solve a problem that made him uncomfortable. "Ms. Graves," he said formally, "the county has received reports regarding the structure you've discovered on your property. I'm here to examine it and determine whether it's government property." Vivian asked what difference that made, and Parsons explained that if the shelter was government property, built by government contractors with government funds, and designed according to government specifications, then it might legally be the property of the government, not of Vivian's inherited estate. Federal law regarding Cold War civil defense infrastructure can be complex, Parsons said, reading from a document he'd brought with him. If this facility was constructed as part of a federal program, funded with federal money, built to federal specifications, there could be an argument that it remains government property, regardless of where it's located. Patricia Shen demolished that argument with the kind of systematic legal destruction that Vivian found deeply satisfying. The shelter had been constructed on Vivian's property, on land her great-uncle had owned and maintained. The government had contracted Thomas Graves as a private individual. compensated him for his work, and given him a property deed that he'd maintained for decades. All the documentation existed in his journals, in his carefully preserved records. The government had not claimed ownership of the property or the shelter in the decades since the Cold War's end. Patricia sent a letter to the county, to the federal government, and to Heritage Homes Development, making Vivian's legal position absolutely clear. The shelter was her property. The artifacts were her property. The gold and bonds and assets Thomas Graves had accumulated were her property. The only thing negotiable was how she chose to use them, preserve them, or donate them. Expanded resolution and legacy. By November, the legal position was airtight. The will was genuine and clear. The documentation proved personal property rather than government property. The historical materials were Vivian's to do with, as she chose. She began working with the National Archives on a donation agreement that would benefit her substantially through tax deductions while serving the broader historical record. The documents would be preserved, digitized, and made available to researchers. The shelter itself would be protected through a conservation easement that prevented commercial development while allowing for historical preservation and educational use. The gold and bonds were valued, cataloged, and secured in a climate-controlled vault. Vivian hired contractors to carefully restore the shelter, stabilizing the structure, updating the utility systems, making the space safe and accessible for visitors. By late December, the shelter was welcoming its first official groups. Historians, graduate students, Cold War enthusiasts, and simply curious people driving up rural Virginia roads to see the place where American history had been preserved in concrete and steel. Vivian found she had a gift for explaining the significance of what visitors were seeing, for translating the technical details into comprehensible narratives, for helping people understand why a fallout shelter from the Cold War mattered in an era when nuclear annihilation felt less like an imminent threat and more like historical paranoia. One afternoon in late January, a ceremony was held at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Vivian stood before a small audience of historians, archivists, and media representatives, looking at a display of Thomas Graves's journals and documentation. She spoke about her great-uncle's work, about his belief that he was building for something larger than himself, about his careful documentation of what he was doing and why. He was engineering for the future, Vivian said, her voice steady and clear. Even though he could never talk about what he was building, even though he had to keep it secret, even though much of what he did was classified and compartmentalized, he was thinking about what would last, what would matter 50 years after he was gone. He documented everything, he preserved everything, and somehow he made sure that when he died, this information would reach someone who would care enough to preserve it further, to make sure the historical record didn't lose what he'd spent his life building. After the ceremony, Vivian sat alone in the archive's reading room, looking at her great-uncle's handwriting, understanding finally what the inheritance had truly been about. It wasn't about the money, though the money was real and significant. It was about connection, about history, about being entrusted with the careful preservation of something that mattered. By spring, Vivian had made her final decision about the property. She'd purchased 40 acres adjacent to the shelter, built a small cottage for herself, and established a foundation dedicated to documenting and preserving Cold War civil defense infrastructure. She'd also begun a relationship with Daniel, the contractor who descended the ladder into the darkness and recognized what they were looking at, who understood that some discoveries mattered precisely because of the effort required to understand them. One afternoon in late April, a year after her initial inheritance letter, Vivian stood on the porch of her new cottage, looking out at the Virginia hills. She thought about the bank's assessment of $12,000. She thought about her sister Rebecca's certainty that the only rational response was to sell. She thought about Marcus's half-laugh when she'd told him about the worthless land. She thought about how many times in life you were told that something didn't matter, that something was worthless, that the expected response was to accept the assessment and move on without questions. What if you didn't? What if you asked one more question? What if you drove out to see the land yourself? What if you found the rusted grate and called a friend and said yes to descending into darkness? What if you said no to developers who offered millions? No to the convenient narrative that worthless land should simply be sold? The shelter had become more than a historical site. It had become a monument to the decision to look deeper, to trust your instincts, to believe that value existed in unexpected places, in the overlooked and dismissed corners of the world. By late summer, the shelter had been visited by nearly 2,000 people. A university had developed an entire academic program around Cold War civil defense. The Archives exhibition featuring Thomas Graves's journals had become one of their most visited online collections. And Vivian had built a life in Virginia that bore almost no resemblance to the life she'd been living in the city. A life based not on prescribed expectations, but on discovery, preservation, and the belief that the things the world dismissed were sometimes exactly where value was hiding.